Welcome to week 4. This is my one and only video for you this week because I'd much rather you spend your time finishing the documentary and discussion board from last week and engaging with the materials that I've provided for you. It looks like a lot, but it's not. I included the page numbers. I've uploaded the demystifying disability chapter, and the 2 videos I have you watching are just 5 minutes each. So the purpose of this video is not to go over all those materials as much as it is to quickly summarize and connect them as we move forward from here. Remember that we're starting with a really wide scope of history, legislation, advocacy, ableism, inclusion, and this is serving to narrow down so that we all have some common knowledge and get into the application piece, which we start next week for special education, inclusive education, and general education. As we narrow down, we're providing information and data to apply, but also to make sure we all have some common knowledge and resources that we can put our fingers on and put into action. The chapter I had you read from Demystifying Disability is the last chapter we'll read from that book. If you don't have that book, Grand Valley Library has a copy that you can check out, but I'd highly recommend reading it. It's an easy read, but also one of the most outstanding viewpoints and summaries that I can think of that has to do with our work in working with individuals with disabilities. That chapter provides examples and overview of ableism, a very important definition of systemic ableism on pages 71 and 72, and really a call to action in our communities, in our country, in our world, everywhere to end ableism. I was especially moved by the author's efforts herself and call for us to fight ableism with individualization, looking at individuals just as that, maybe not as a disability community, but as a person with a disability. Moving on from there, I had you read just the first 5 pages of an article from here. It's old. It is an old article, but he tells the story of a mom named Penny and a student named Joe, and it's a historical look at ableism in education. It examines ableist assumptions that influence the education of students with disabilities. I had you read just the 5 pages and stop when the author starts to examine specific disabilities. I think he specifically talks about students that are deaf and hard of hearing, visually impaired, and then learning disabled. You're welcome to go on and read and continue with his recommendation for ending ableism in schools. But I found that article to be pretty dated, so I'm only highlighting certain things here. First, that you read kind of the history of ableism in schools in the first 5 pages. And then now I'm going to go over what some of his recommendations were. The author recommends that says that we can end ableism in education by first including disability as part of the school's including disability as part of the school's overall diversity efforts. Don't leave out someone having a disability or people with disabilities when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is echoed in our Demystifying Disability chapter this week. The second thing he talks about is encouraging students with disabilities to develop and use skills and modes of expression that are effective and efficient, not just the standard. And then his third recommendation is employ the concepts of UDL to schooling. These go together. If we are teaching to diversity and using universal design for learning, all students can communicate, express themselves, and be successful. Fourth recommendation from our author was that special education should be specialized. He makes a big point of saying it should be based on the general education curriculum, but special education is something different, but a vehicle to access to that general education curriculum. In other words, it's not special education curriculum and general education curriculum that are 2 different things. All students should have access to the general education curriculum, and special education is the vehicle that helps everybody access that. This is the historical part of this article. This was kind of at the beginning of all schools, states, and federally moving to standards-based education. So that kind of tells you where they're coming from, but we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to that. One of his last recommendations was to move away from the current obsession with placements toward an obsession with results, essentially ending the segregation of students with disabilities, being in separate classrooms, separate schools, separate programs, and making sure that there's a continuum of services, that they are able to be successful with their peers and the services that they need. The last suggestion the author had in that HERE article that I only had you read the first 5 pages for was to promote high standards, not high stakes testing, to have high expectations, but to minimize the emphasis on problematic testing. Again, that's more about the history of when they wrote that article than it is, we still have problems with this today, but it isn't one of our biggest problems. Lastly, I have 3 resources for you from Dr. Shelley Moore. She's from Canada, which explains some of her weird call-outs to Canadian people. But what's most exciting to me is the really accessible and general ways she describes inclusion and inclusive education in these 3 resources. The exciting news also is that she is the keynote speaker at our MCEC conference, which is coming up at the end of February, and I've included information about that in one of the slides for this lecture. First, I'm having you read her blog. It's a very quick blog that explains the concept of inclusion and inclusive ed with her visuals of the dots. Read that. It's a very quick read, but it explains the visuals that she uses in the second material I'm asking you to engage with, and that's her 5-minute evolution of inclusion video, in which she gives a really good educational history. I consider this an updated version of what we read in the HERE article. Lastly, I have you listening to one more of her videos called Inclusion 2.0, and I think this is the star of our week. This brings us down into focus and talks about the differences between inclusion and inclusive education. Inclusion was a big movement for the last 20 years to get students with disabilities in general education classrooms. She then starts to describe how we can do better. And she doesn't exactly use the words, but she describes inclusive education, the models of instruction we need. And she talks about it through teacher workload and teaching to diversity. And I think she does a much better job than I do, so I'm going to stop talking. The next slide that you'll see, and the last thing I want to remind you of, is that I put a quick review of least restrictive environment and the work we're doing at the state, where Michigan Department of Education is going out and interviewing general education professionals, teachers, administrators, staff, so that we can provide more work on the things that we need together, and then we're getting the data that we need to do that. Thanks for listening. Dive into all those materials and continue to contact me if you have any questions.